Welcome to another episode of From the Grassroots, a podcast that looks at African American history in Alabama and those who've preserved it and taken part in it. My name is Justin Rudder, and today I'm interviewing Mr. Joseph Caver, who was the first African American archivist hired by the state of Alabama. How are you doing, Mr. Caver?
I'm fine. I'm happy to be with you.
Yes, sir. And we've been kind of talking before this just about the development of ASU and just it's amazing the little tidbits that underline just the overall narrative of like how we came to the civil rights movement and just overall Black history in Alabama. But I'd like to first start out. Was sort of where you grew up, what your experiences were growing up. And I know that, and it's a rolled up article I have, but this was came out at the end of November, and it was your reflections on the Turkey Day Classic.
Yes.
And so it sounds like you had really an interesting childhood. So could you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, after thinking back to my interest in state and local history, I go back to my grandfather, who was born in 1878
Okay.
in rural Autauga County.
Okay.
And my job on Saturday morning was to shave his head. He was Kojak before Kojak was popular.
Okay.
And he would tell me stories about his childhood growing up. And those stories just stuck with me.
Okay.
So I went to finish school at Talkerville High School in 1970 and enrolled at Alabama State and majored in history and minored in political science. Fell under the influence of Dr. Norman Walton and Miss Bert Underwood and Thelma Glass.
Okay.
And B.J. Sims. These are some of the stories of the era. And it just fascinated me.
Okay.
However, in 1974, when I graduated, I couldn't find a job. But I applied for a position with the state of Alabama at the state archives here. And went back to school to become certified working with special needs kids. Okay. And so in the fall, I got a job teaching schools special education in Chilton County. And in December of 1975, I get called in for an interview. I put on my only suit at the time, and I come trudging into the state archives. I was amazed at the marvel. This was my first time coming to this building. Wow. And Milo B. Howard, the most elaborate office ever seen, wood panels, spun around in his chair and introduced himself to me. And he asked me one question. He asked me if I had to do research in Alabama history, could I identify a source? And I had recently written a paper my senior year at Alabama State on Colonial Mobile, and I used Owen's History of Alabama. Mm-hmm. And I blurted out, Owen's History of Alabama. And he spun around and he said, that'll be all. I would walk down the terrace, and he come running out and he said, hey, you want the job? And that's how I was hired at the state archives, not knowing that I was replacing David Ossobrook, who had worked on the Jimmy Carter presidential election. And he had been hired by the National Archives, and he went to Washington and later would organize the Carter Center in Atlanta. He stayed in the National Archives system. He organized the Bush Presidential Library and the Clinton Library. And I think David is now in Mobile, retired, but that's who I replaced. and I became the first black archivist for the state of Alabama. Now, I wasn't the first black archivist because Daniel Williams at Tuskegee was also a black archivist. And Alan Jones, one of the professors at Auburn, introduced Dan and I. We became lifelong friends before his death. So that's how I got to the archives, and I was hired to be the civil archivist.
Okay.
Down in the basement. All of the constitutional officers of the state, papers I was responsible for, the governor's papers, the newspapers, Secretary of State, you name it.
Yeah.
So, and I, besides organizing and managing the vast collection, I also was responsible for disseminating the data.
Okay.
So I got to meet distinguished historians like J. Mills Thorne and Wayne Flint and you name it, people that did research in the 70s. And of course, during this time period, we're seeing a shift in the writing of history, the interest in, I guess at that time we called revisionist history. Having grown up in Alabama and used the third grade book, No Alabama, where it describes slavery as the happiest time in a person's life. Now these new historians are introducing me to data, and it proves that it wasn't the happiest time. Reading the slave narratives that was done in the 1930s, and so I'm saying, Then I thought back to my grandfather and his childhood and his age. But that was my journey here. And working for Milo Howard was in the spirit. He was a walking encyclopedia.
Okay.
But how should I describe him? He was a gentle person, the gold tip king. He would have been at home in the 19th century Alabama. I think he was having problems with the new research and the new emphasis on the comprehensive history of the state. He glorified the Confederacy and the Dunning School of thought.
Well, I know there's so much you've talked about, and I'd love to kind of pinpoint out stuff and kind of flesh it out. But speaking on Milo Howard, and of course, I left my job at the archives. Any archive staff members that will hear this, but I had the honor for a long time of sort of being Gwen Patton's chauffeur.
Oh.
and Gwynne Patton, of course, was the archivist at Trenton. But she was also, involved in the civil rights movement, especially with Selma to Montgomery March and different things like that. And she said that the first time she came in the state archives,
I remember it well.
Basically, it was Milo Howard. I can't remember exactly. I don't want to inaccurately describe the encounter, but it was basically he was kind of resistant to her when she came in, from how she described it, and it's amazing. And that whole time period is actually, I've been looking more into like Alabama, like Black historic preservation, and again, we can delve into this a little further.
Let me tell you the story about Gwynne Patton, a wonderful person, but feisty. And I'm in the basement, and she disrupted the researchers that we had in there. She's told me that I was an Uncle Tom and that I was keeping the records away from her. later she came back and apologized when I introduced her to the committee to preserve the peace and showed her pictures of herself when she was in the protest movement at Tuskegee and involved in Muhammad Ali's visit here in 1966. That's Gwen Patton.
Okay.
But we became very dear and close friends. But at the first meeting did not go over very well. I was trying to do my job and maintain decor in the reading room.
Yeah. Wow.
But she was very disruptive. But all of that passed and we became very good friends.
Okay.
Now, Justin, I'll probably be talking all over the place.
Oh no, that's
So I started my job here in 19.
well, and I'd love to know just a little bit more about your childhood. And you went
Oh,
through
okay,
it, but
okay.
like your grandfather, what was his name?
Willie Caver.
Willie Caver.
And he went to a common school at my home church, but Thursday Baptist Church
Okay.
in Independence, Alabama.
Okay.
And he talked about his blueback speller. He was not very well educated, but he lived to be, he died in 1973, so he lived to be in his late 90s. Remember I was telling you about the head, and I asked him why did he shave his head, and he said he didn't, when he started getting gray, he didn't want the women folks to know he was getting old.
Wow.
But he told me so many stories, but he lived during that era in our history, which some people may find to be unpleasant, but he also inspired in me the family strength of holding the family together. Example was when I came home, I believe in the 8th grade, he was plying his mule in the field. He's an old man. And I had just learned about the Great Depression. And we called him Big Dad, and I went running out. I said, Big Dad, tell me about the Great Depression. And he said, we was poor going in and we was poor coming out, but we never missed a meal. He grew food, he raised pigs, cows, goats. They had meat. The only thing that the family could not get at that time was sugar, so they used honey and sugar cane for sweetness. But he was the head of a ferocious appetite. That's why he lived so long. And he didn't drink or smoke, which was highly unusual for a black man in Alabama at that particular time. He told me about his first marriage and the breakup with his first wife. I later learned he had a child that when I discovered once I got here at the archives working on my genealogy, and married my grandmother in 1921. But a fascinating man who inspired me and his family. He provided. He never had a lot of money, but he grew and took care of his family. It was just my background comes from farming. He was a sharecropper. He was unique, I should say.
Now, and I know we're Facebook friends, and I see a lot of the things you post are really fascinating about, I think, a lot of ties to Autauga County, and
Yes.
I believe I may be not remembering correctly, but you've posted some things I think related to the McQueen Smith area.
Yes, even though it's McQueen Smith is east of Prattville, and a unique story that with this family relocating from Iowa.
Okay.
They had made their money by founding the Maytag washing machine.
Wow.
McQueen Smith, and Smithers, that's what they call the community.
Uh-huh.
Now, my involvement is with Larry Caver, no relationship,
Okay.
but same name.
Okay.
In the Old Autauga Historical Society, we have a meeting at Ivy Creek on January 11th,
Okay.
which is an old Methodist church on Highway 14 between Autaugaville and Selma.
Okay.
And of course, my interest was in that Thursday and the black churches there. And Mallet Chapel and AME Church, the land was donated to the blacks in that church. Larry has recently published something on Old Harmony, and with the 1847 and 1859 membership roster. And the things that I've learned in research was these churches during the antebellum period, most had a larger black membership than white membership. And the roster included slaves and surprisingly 2 free blacks in Autauga County in 1847. Wow. That fascinated me. Now I'm getting off the story.
No, that's fine.
But when I made it to high school after going to common schools at a community and independent and friendship, to Rosenwald schools, 2-room schoolhouses, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade in one room, and 4th, 5th, and 6th grade in another room. That's my elementary education.
And what were the names of those?
Friendship and Independence. Now there
Independence,
is, if I'm not wrong, there's one Rosenwald school in Mount Sinai. You can Google that. That give you an idea about the white buildings. And of course, the Rosenwald schools were established by Rosenwald Foundation, Seals and Roebuck, and the friendship between Booker T. Washington. They went throughout Alabama and the South, planning these schools for blacks and whites, for that matter, in the rural section of Alabama and throughout the South. So 7th grade, I go to the Autauga County Training School. And I think I told you the story about how training school evolved.
Well, if you could kind of go through one more time, just I understand it was through ASTA, or
yes. In 1907, the state legislature passed a law mandating high schools be established in each county of Alabama. Excluded are blacks. So the Alabama State Teachers Association came up with a wonderful idea, aided by the Slater and the Jeans Fund. They will call the secondary schools training school. So you had, in Autauga County, you had the Autauga County High School, Prattville High today, and the Autauga County Training School. What separates it is the training, and they are set up to support vocational and agricultural schools. So it was established in 1919, and by 1931 it was going to the 12th grade. So that's how secondary education was expanded to most black Alabamians, through the training school concept. And that was a little more palpable. Once the schools were established, they would go to the county and ask the county to support. So they were merged into the county school system. But there was a training school and a high school. So that's the teens in the 20s. And this is, and the training school in Autaugaville existed until 1969, when finally, after all of the fight by the politician, mainly George Wallace, to fight integration, even though Brown decision had been handed down in 1954, the schools really were not integrated until 1969 and 70.
And that was like partially through that Lee versus Macon.
Right, there you go, which merged all of the case. Up until that point, you had to go to court to fight individual cases, but the Lee versus Macon forced all of the schools then. And back to McQueen Smith. I went to work as a teenager for the women's in Autaugaville. the Ottawa Farming Society. Diane Wellman, who is the main benefactor.
And how do you spell that last name?
Wendland.
Okay.
Huntington College, big supporter, donor to the Huntington.
Okay.
But very wealthy.
Wow.
Because of her connection back to that Maytag washing machine fortune. So that's how I made that connection with McQueen Smith farm, and through the Wendland. I learned that later in life. So I was in the first integrated class at that time. Was Hicks Memorial. Today is Otagoville High School. They closed down most of the training schools in the state, and black students were sent to then majority white schools. My senior year, the school was 50% black, 50% white. Even though this period is quite tumultuous, some racial incidents that I recalled, but
were there any you remember?
Yes, Alvin Perry was some guys that I know, white guys, followed him home. He got off the bus, they beat him up. And the reason was supposedly he was eyeballing one guy's girlfriend, white girlfriend. So that was one of the racial things. But tremendous thing, the black teachers and the white teachers, we sort of lost control because the white teachers was afraid to discipline the black students, and the black teachers were afraid to discipline the white students. And we're still feeling the ramification from that transition. We still haven't totally recovered from that integration of the schools. And of course, today the schools are being resegregated. And particularly in the Black Belt and in Central Alabama, yes.
And that's an interesting topic about discipline and different things. And just sort of a personal perspective, when I was in elementary school, I went to Flowers here in Montgomery, and we're mixed. It was by the early 90s that I went to elementary school, so it wasn't that big of a culture shock.
Right, 20 years later.
Yeah, but it's still, I think and when we talk about discipline, it's sort of like the white, like you say, the black teachers are afraid to discipline white students and vice versa. I think that still kind of resonates. It's like, you don't want to be taken as a bigot if you're trying to...
It created problems.
Yeah, you're just trying to teach children, keep them in line, basically, overall.
The other thing that I would point out to you, like in Ottawa and Montgomery County, the last ad valorem tax increase occurs either in 1968 or 1969. And since that time, there have not been an increase in ad valorem tax in Montgomery County or Ottawa County. Okay. And that could be only one reason: integration and, of course, the establishment of segregated schools, private schools. Yes. So we're still feeling those effects from that integration period.
So it's sort of like, I guess, and I fully am on board with, I think, and unfortunately you see this in Montgomery and other places, that it's like with Eastdale Mall and even with Montgomery Mall, it's, they're almost, it's that white flight, and in a way, I've grown up, in a majority, it's sort of lower middle class where I've come from, and we're, we've grown up in usually mixed racial neighborhoods, but I still have grandparents that will say, well, it's because of the blacks, it was just violent, or that, you had a lot of thugs come in. And to me, I think, instead of trying to leave that situation, it would be nice to see, like, I hate to see that like Montgomery Mall and Eastdale Mall are that way, because it's like it's not. It's more complicated than that.
Yes.
It's you can implement, I mean, and there's controversy over like police brutality and different things like that. But I think if you had kind of greater enforcement of just rules, like,
But
just,
whenever change occurs,
yeah.
you always have positive, you have negative. Not only did whites move out of the neighborhoods, and you have white flights to the suburbs, to the Elmore, Target County, but you also had black professionals that was, like I was describing, the Depression and even up through the Montgomery bus boycott. You had working class, you had the educated class, but the professional moved out of those neighborhoods and moved to East Montgomery or Prattville and Elmore County. So that left in that population basically a lower socioeconomic group. And that's what you're dealing with in some schools. The schools reflect the overall socioeconomic level of that community.
Okay.
So there were just not white flight.
Yeah.
There were also middle class black flights, those who had gone to college and don't live in West Montgomery or South Montgomery, but
Yeah.
and of course that would lead to the Eastdale and the Montgomery Mall, the community, the surrounding community, or the economic level of it is.
But one thing, and then we'll move on to asking another question. But the thing to me, it's sad. You see all these businesses, even that were on, like I say, Eastern Boulevard. Like you had Best Buy, Books A Million. Even at Eastdale Mall. I mean, it used to be a hub of like white and black activity,
Right.
And now. What's fascinating to me, you had those businesses moving out to like East Chase, the little more ritzier places to shop, but like at Eastdale Mall, from what I've seen, it's fascinating that you see a lot of. It actually gives a lot of black entrepreneurs the opportunity to
Right.
have thriving businesses. But anyway.
But this is not only a local trend, but it's a national trend with enclosed malls.
Yeah.
With the culture we're living in now, not only whites but blacks also don't consider to be safe in that environment. So
we could go on and on about that, but I guess my next question is, where did you go to school, and how did you get your training in the library sciences?
Well, mainly I was self-taught.
Okay.
But I just a bachelor's in history and loving to read. But all of my archival training came from working here.
Okay.
And I think Sala, does it still exist?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was an officer in that.
Okay.
And attending conference and working around other archivists and professions.
Yes, sir.
And of course, the Nagara, they sent me those conventions, and when I went to Maxwell, I went to the National Archives for 2 weeks training. I'm reading about provenance and all of that, but basically I learned the basic here at the State Archives. Okay. This is, I was telling you earlier about microfilming and metadata, indexing, thing, and I just absorbed this. One of my first assignment here was to index the original land records.
Okay.
That it used to be in the library. I was telling you about the.
Yeah.
You could find out who owned what. And with that, I'm on HBC SWAC page, the Alcorn State, and I ran across this name Chastain. If you are familiar with that.
Down in Mobile.
Black they got Spanish land grants. And later they'll move to New Orleans and Hattiesburg and all over that place. But owned slaves. And of course, after the Nat Turner Revolt, Alabama passed the slave codes in 1833 and 32 that prohibited the teaching of blacks. But the Creole populations, Baldwin and Mobile counties, went to court. Okay. And the court ruled that they was protected under the Louisiana Purchase Agreement.
Okay.
And they had to have a school for these people, these blacks.
I didn't know that. I've been very blessed. I actually wrote an article on territorial and statehood slavery for Alabama Heritage, and that is interesting. It's fascinating. What I found was that you have more this intermixing of white, black, Native American. It's sort of, I call it more fluid. You can kind of go in between the different classes. And of course, there were penalties against the slaves, but it, like you say, after Nat Turner, and around that time, and especially like with Andrew Jackson, a lot of different factors, it cracks down on the African American.
Right. Now, during this particular time, after I go to Maxwell, Ed Bridges is hired as the archivist here. Okay. And I met Ed at some conventions, I think in St. Louis he was. And his major professor at the University of Chicago was John Hope Franklin.
Really?
So Dr. Franklin will come to Montgomery and we'll go out to eat and talk.
Wow.
And he described his visit to the state archives when he was working on his what's the book, Up From Slavery.
Okay.
The book, his famous book.
Yeah.
And how Marie Bankhead Owens, he couldn't use the reading room. He was working on his doctorate.
Oh wow.
And she allowed him to roam the stacks. But anyway, he got me interested in maroon societies in Alabama. Now, this is something that I want to come back to and work on. And we found these colonies in the Chattahoochee Valley region. Okay. Eufaula, Phoenix City, when the removal of the 5 civilized tribes, many particular creeks ran off instead of moving to Oklahoma and the Trail of Tears. And they formed these colonies and runaway slaves. That's where these maroon societies occurs. And eventually they migrate to Appalachia, into Florida, and they become the Seminoles. Now, I don't know if you watch Florida State football, but Chief Osceola comes out and he's a black man. Okay. He's a black Seminole. But he was born in Macon County.
I have heard that, but I didn't know he was black.
That was a part of that migration, those maroon societies migrating into Florida. And of course, the Seminoles Wars, 1847? Yeah.
and some of my research, I noticed there's a book by a guy named Anthony Jean Carey, Sold Down the River, but it talks a little bit about slavery on the Chattahoochee, and one just a little bit he points out that there was. In the Creek tribes, there was sort of a division, and I think it was more the European, the Creeks that had more contact with Europeans.
The Scottish traders.
McGillivray.
And the Cherokees had slaves, black slaves. So, but these people are coalescing together because of the Native Americans going to be taken to Oklahoma, and the blacks just we've seen the movie Harriet.
I haven't yet. I hate to admit it. I don't get to the movies as much as I should, but yeah, like you say, he was pointing out. You had these creeks like McGillivray and McIntosh, but you also, and especially like in the creek, the Chattahoochee area, there were actually Native American sites where, uh, like I say, there was more fluid movement. I think there was like he has one instance that I can't think of the chief's name, but I think there's actually a person of African descent that becomes a chief at one of the
Well, Osceola
villages.
becomes a chief.
Yeah.
But then I was also, while working here, introduced to the Peter Brown collection.
Okay.
And Tecumseh visit to Tuckabatcha here in 1811, and at the council, he told them, the white settlers approaching in on the native territory, and the council, he's in Ohio, and they said, well, when will we know to start fighting and defending our homeland? And he said he was stomp his foot in Ohio, and you feel the effect here. So the last earthquake, major earthquake on the East Coast, occurs in 1812.
Oh.
This is where the Mississippi River reverses its flow. And it starts the Creek and Indian War, the attack on Fort Mims, the canoe fight and all that. And of course, Andrew Jackson marches down from Tennessee and Claiborne from south.
So.
And of course, that time period. But basically, in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Treaty of Fort Jackson opened this area up for the planters that moved in. I was talking earlier about William Rufus King and the King family and all of the planters carving out tremendous wealth on the back of the slaves that they brought with them and occupying the territory, the land from. And that's why I told you earlier about the land grant, the land records. Land sold at Millersville outside of Atlanta, Sparta, and Conecuh County, Huntsville, and Cahaba. Fascinating story. I learned all of that by working here. And but Dr. Franklin, even though I was never his student, but just interacting with him and, of course, getting to know Dr. Bridges very well as a friend. And we talked about, just like you and I are talking about Alabama history. But then I leave the training school and go to Alabama State and major in history. And just as today, there are not a lot of jobs for historians. And I'm so blessed that I was hired here. And I went in a different direction into archival management. And it gave me an opportunity. If I had remained a teacher, my wife taught school for 37 years, and we each had a master's degree. And but I was making, when we retired, twice as much money as she was making as a teacher with 30 plus years of experience. So I know, Justin, I'm veering all over the place.
That's okay. To me, I want this to be a conversation.
Now, I would like to also point out to you, there was a schism between Dr. Allen Jones at Auburn and Milo Howell.
Really?
Yes. They didn't like each other. Now, they respected each other. Now, as you know, Dr. Jones started the archival management program in Auburn, and Jeff Jakeman and other people followed him there. But he got me involved in the Alabama Historical Association. Okay. He made, he forced the association to integrate.
Really?
Dan Wiggin was the first member.
Okay. So you saying there was sort of the Alabama Historical Association, are you saying there was sort of a separate black association?
No association existed.
Okay.
Except the study for Negro life and history
Okay.
that
Woodson.
Carter G. Woodson started, which, by the way, they're going to have their annual meeting here in September.
I've heard.
Yeah, okay. And the archives is involved in that.
Okay.
But then you had Harper Council Trenum, who edited the Bulletin, the Negro Bulletin, and of course John Hope Franklin, who was a expert witness in the Brown decision and the new Thurgood Marshall. It was Dr. Trenum records, ASTA records, that tracked funding for black schools versus white schools in the state. Okay. His records were key in winning that unanimous decision at the Supreme Court in '54. So Dr. Franklin is telling me all of this. He was also hired at Alabama State to teach, but he left, and of course they went to Fisk, I believe, and eventually ended up at the University of Chicago and retired at Duke. Professor Emeritus before he died. Wow, what a great historian.
Yes, sir.
A premier historian. But even though there was a schism between Allen Jones and Milo Howard, Dr. Jones got me on my master's thesis. One of his students brought me upstairs, and I pulled the American Missionary Association microfilm, which led to the incorporation of Alabama State, predecessor Lincoln School, in 1867. And I wrote my thesis in 1982, basically because of that. But Milo Howard, though, I have to give him credit. He also connected me with Jim Loeb, and Mary Ann Neely, Landmark, and he was behind me being appointed to the Montgomery Historical Development Commission. And got me involved in preservation of old structures.
Wow.
And we started out on Commerce Street downtown, those warehouses that are down there, and preserving them. And so I'm on the Montgomery County, Montgomery Historical Commission. So even though Alan, he had one role and Milo had another role, but I benefited from both of these two gentlemen.
Wow.
I think Dr. Jones is still alive.
I believe so. And I believe he has a relative, Caroline Jones, that
Yes.
I've met a few times. But I've heard of Alan Jones quite a bit, and I've emailed him briefly. But yeah, that's amazing. I didn't know there was such a rift between him
It all
and
started
Howard.
when they were students at Auburn.
Really?
Yeah, it goes all the way back to that, to Dr. Ray and Milo and Alan Jones. Believe it or not, I never could understand the skills. And then it morphed into the business of the Alabama Historical Association because of that.
It's all connected. That's what fascinates me. There are roots everywhere. There's actually, I've been working on researching, like, again, the history of Black historic preservation in Alabama, and I know that Zelia Evans was involved with the landmarks. And there was, of course, that's how I came across your name being tied to the archives. But talking about Milo Howard, and again, I feel like I'm bashing Milo Howard, but it's
no.
There's an event where I know the first director of the historical commission was Warner Floyd.
Yes.
And I know that it's something I just have been trying to.
All of this is going on from the era I'm describing to you. I think the break occurred over on Monroe Street was the Lurleen Wallace museum or something over that property.
There was a museum.
And yes, and Warner Floyd, of course, being the historical commission, was an outsider, and he was not back to this revisionist history and all of that. And he was not well thought of. He had some ideas on the antebellum homes and a more complete story of the plantation themselves than just the old South hoop skirts and mint juleps.
That's what I get a feeling of, because he actually, I found in just our vertical files, or I guess the AHC vertical files that we have, he actually sent a letter to Alvin Holmes after they had like a telephone conversation, and he was talking about, it was basically, can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but he was talking about that how, I guess, trying to tell Holmes that yes, we are trying to invest more in preserving African American history. And he mentioned things like, I think in 1973 you get Tuskegee University becoming a National Historic Park.
Carver Museum, all of that developing, yes.
And he also mentioned the Clotilda Bell.
Yes.
And that's kind of neat. And it supposedly went missing in 1985 somewhere. But anyway, that's...
Well, let's go back to that one.
Okay.
While I'm here, Mike Figures is the senator from Pritchard.
Okay.
And he came here.
Okay.
And of course, we going through the Mobile Register and trying to get the story behind the Clotilda.
Okay.
So,
wow.
Mike Figures, and at that time, the mayor of Pritchard, who was another black man, John, I can't recall his name, but he introduced us to that. But there was tremendous opposition initially to recognizing the Clotilda, the last slave ship. And of course, recently they found the remnants of the ship and the Mayer brothers. But anyway, I had the opportunity to share the newspaper clip, and they documented Mayer sitting in the bar on what's the street in Mobile, downtown, Broad Street Canal. Broad Street. In the bar, and they had a bet that they could sail to Africa and bring a load of slaves back and run the railroads. And then in 1927, Carter G. Woodson sent Zora Neale Hurston to Mobile, and she introduced and interviewed Cudjoe Lewis, who was the leader of those blacks that were brought here as slaves, and the establishment of Africa Town. And of course, her book that came out several years ago.
At Barracoon.
Yeah, and that's the story of that. But anyway, Mike Figures, and then there's a push now towards trying to integrate black history and Southern history into the forefront, and there was opposition to this move. Alan Jones was on one side, Milo Howard and other conservatives was on the other side. And Warner Floyd is the one, he's on one side also. And there's conflict, open conflict with these guys.
And I was wondering how that came about, because it was like I think it was like 1978, I believe, when it's like the summer of 1978, and it's like in June, Floyd, and it's amazing, it's very well documented in newspapers that he's like, oh, well, there's political pressure, and Howard is putting so much pressure on me, I'm just going to resign. And I may get my facts screwed up, but it sounds like he comes back and then he's fired in August.
Right.
With Howard leading the cause against him. So
now, I point out another character involved here would be Michael Thomason, at South Alabama.
Okay.
The archivist at,
I didn't know.
you never heard of Mike? And
Was he a black archivist?
no, white guy.
Okay.
So he's working at the library in Mobile. I already told you about David Osbrook. Okay, Michael Thomason, and then he got involved. Now, most of the records of the Clotilda at University of South Alabama.
Okay.
And Elise Stevens. I don't know how I remember these names,
Oh.
but he's getting involved. Now, Mike is a certified archivist and historian, well published. He got to be in his mid-70s now, but he was one of the young leaders. So we now, of course, you had the old Mobile contingency of white historians, Ray, I forget the names down there, but they was on the board here. And then you had the young historians working and pushing. Then you had the politicians like Alvin Holmes, Fred Gray, Thomas Reed in the legislature pushing to try to expand this. And of course, Gwen Patton, again, raising hell, telling me that we're trying to hide the records. But once I pulled the records of the Committee to Preserve the Peace, I placated her. Made friends. But I was just I want to tell you this story. My first year here as a black, the only other blacks in the building was janitors. Okay. So Miss Leela Legree, she lived across the street. She was, I think, the first female pharmacist in the state.
Okay.
Old money from West Alabama. She's probably in her 80s. Okay. But she would come in every day. She was writing 25 years, 50 years, 100-year column for the Advertiser. Okay. So she had problems connecting with me. I'm sitting at my desk, and so she came and asked a question. She needed a newspaper volume, and she said, so she didn't know how to approach me. She's Old South, and she called me Professor Caver. And I looked at her, and I saw the struggle, and I said, Miss Legree, you can just call me Joe. And she just burst out. But what happened, she was in the office every day. And of course, during this time period, I had a gentleman from Prattville tell me, he said, I used to think our problem was niggers. And Miss Legree jumped up. But to complete the sentence, this guy told me, he said, I finally figured out it wasn't the niggers, it was the Jews that caused all the anti-Semitic racist. And Miss Legree got up, and she comes storming over there. She was my protector.
Oh, wow.
By simply making friends with her. She would not allow any of the visitors or people to harass me or give me a hard time. What a pleasant memory. Yeah. Leela Legree.
Leela Legree.
Like Simon Legree.
Well, and I have to admit, my background, and especially with Trump today and all the news and all that, I have to admit, and I've told people this, and to me this is how we have race discussions, because of course I'm a white boy trying to talk with black people, but the thing is, you know, just like in conversations like this, you realize there's so much, it's deeper.
It's in a merge though, you can't escape. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was telling you about the book signing, Peggy Wallace Kennedy. Yeah. And I asked her the question about her father transitioning from between 1958 and 1962. And then after being shot, transitioned.
He actually had NAACP support in 1958.
Right.
Sorry, I just wanted to...
And came back. He won the governorship in 1962. And she talks about the traumatization of her as a teenager. And then he, after going through the segregationist, the arch conservatism, and she said that he realized after losing the election to Patterson in '58, the only way that he could become governor, he had to be an arch segregationist. But later in his life, I remember working down in the basement. I had to go up and get his papers and the Brewer papers. This man shook my hand 10 times in one day and apologized to me for all of the racial unrest and the bombings and the Selma and Montgomery March and all of that. I believe he believed God was punishing him because he had sold his soul to win and become a governor. In 1982, I voted for him. So
and in '85, talking about Africatown, I was looking the other day. He was actually the one to push through Africatown becoming a state park.
Right.
So,
right.
but anyway, sorry.
He back to the current time period. Yes, he had a saying that you have to put the hay down so the goats can get it. So Trump and Wallace represented is really a Machiavellian approach. You feed the goats. You tell the people we still have remnants of white nationalism and white supremacy in this country. So you have to feed them that. Yeah. Else they won't support you. And you see that transition. Wallace is a perfect example of that. And his daughter identified this. I didn't even raise the issue in her speech to us. And she sees so much currently going on politically in this country that went on when she was a teenager in the 1960s. Yeah. The same principles, the same fears, the fear of change. People will latch on if someone tell them, as Wallace used to tell the people, they think the liberals, the pointy headed liberals think they're better and more sophisticated than us, but we are as smart as they are. Standing up for Alabama, make America great again. Yes, sir. See, and it resonates with a certain segment of the population. Yes, sir. And that's, she made that connection in her book. I bought a copy.
It's The Broken Road.
The Broken, yes. But I lived during that period. And so when I see what's going on nationally, I understand. And I had a discussion with my pastor, and he calls it hate. And I said, is it really hate? If you know anything about Southern culture, blacks and white have lived together and depended on each other for survival throughout our existence. And now the group they may dislike, I think it's more fear than hate. Yeah. Now the fear leads to hateful behavior, like the 16th Street Baptist Church and the brutalization on the Elvis Pettis Bridge and the caging of immigrants on the border. That's fear. Yes. And fear of change. It's not that they really hate Hispanics, Latin Americans.
Well, and it's like you say, it is, and I have to admit, my grandparents, well, now my grandmother, I have to say this is probably too personal, but my grandmother, she could be a control freak. Uh-huh. But my grandfather, he was a very kind man, very gentle, but and he would tell my mom stories of like when he grew up in Fort Deposit, and he actually played with the local black children, and there was nothing wrong with it at the time. I mean, in his mind as a child, but then it's kind of like as he gets older, you know, you get pressured into this whole concept that, you know, well, you don't need to be interacting with them and different things like that. And I guess, and I've heard the N-word quite a bit from my grandparents. And I guess what I always understood it to be, and I think I look at these times as a time to be honest. I have to say that word will pop in my head from time to time. But the way I've looked at it, it's never. I look at it like it's sort of like a black redneck is how.
It's a derogatory term.
Yeah.
When we was going through the civil rights movement, we removed it from our vocabulary.
Yeah.
The hip hop generation has brought it back.
Yeah.
And so now it's openly used. Now, you mentioned your grandfather. Let me tell you about my other side of the family.
Okay. and I hope I didn't offend you. I try to come to this being honest, but respectfully honest.
And I'm a historian. I know and I know the culture. My mother's father was a white man.
Really?
Yes. So I was telling you about my paternal grandfather earlier.
Wow.
That's my dad's father.
Yeah.
And of course, I've done the DNA, and so I'm 33% Caucasian, European. Okay. Yeah. And Robert Jefferson Langford had 27 children, 6 white, 21 black children by 3 different black women, including my mother and my uncle and my aunt.
Yeah.
So the family, the Langfords, are unique. And Larry and Caver and I talk about this all the time because he also has that lineage. That's why I get.
Sorry, y'all. I get the feeling that y'all maybe not directly related, but it sounds like maybe distant.
Through this line.
Yeah.
Baxter B. Langford is buried across in the cemetery. He's a Confederate veteran. And my paternal grandmother, great-grandmother, is buried in the black section of the cemetery. So,
okay. Wow.
But Bob Langford had all of these black children by 3 different black women. Terrence Howard, the actor, is my cousin.
Wow.
The green eyes.
I think. Oh yeah, wasn't he in Empire?
Yes, that's him.
Okay.
But this is Bob Langford.
Okay.
Protege. Okay. So the family is so unique. 2 of his white sons love black women also. This man in the 20s had over 12,000 acres of land.
Wow.
He was a census taker. He was big going. He went bankrupt in 1934, the Depression.
Wow.
He had mortgaged the land to the New Orleans Land Bank. They auctioned it off. My mama's half brothers, the white one, Alan, came back from World War II, and they bought the land. So my mom didn't get any of this back, but he had 2 black sons by a black woman, and he's since passed, and the land portion of that acreage went to those black Dilla and Joel Talley is his name. Now, one of his oldest son, Peyton, his son is in Birmingham during the Children's March.
Really?
He's the head of the Otago County Ku Klux Klan.
Oh my.
You get it? You're sleeping with black women, and you also heading the Klan. He lost his son. His son was killed in Birmingham in 1963. So the culture is so complex. And even though he didn't leave my mom and her brothers and sisters in any land, but they knew each other. Like Larry, he knew my history because of his ancestors. So we can have this discussion and understand each other. So you go from 2 of the brothers loving black women, following in their father's footsteps, and another brother heading up the Klan.
Oh my word.
and burning crosses in black folks' yard during the civil rights movement and opposing this. So it's
That's
this
a
is
book
thi-
in itself.
this is Alabama. This is Alabama in the South. Miscegenation is greater than most people. It's not only during the antebellum period; it goes all the way up to to the 60s. My mom was born in 1934. My dad said the reason Bob Langford lost all that land was he was chasing behind black women, gambling on chicken fights and dog fights, and drinking moonshine. His dad died in 1899. He came out of the Civil War. He was a law-loving addict. You,
Okay.
you
A Lawlin, what?
this is opium and alcohol.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. I learn new stuff all the time, so.
Laughlin, I think I'm pronouncing
Okay.
it right.
Okay.
But he died. He was an addict.
Wow.
But you see this, and this is not talked about a lot in history, particularly with those civil rights veterans, Civil War veterans who get injured in the war. Morphine and of course the drug laws are lenient at that time, and so we have that in the family.
Wow.
And
All the skeletons.
all of the skeletons, but the descendants, we've had reunions, and the white descendants and the black descendants, we recognize our roots going back to this dysfunctional family. It's very complicated.
Well, in kind of talking about that, I just want to interject. When I was in elementary school, or it may have been, I think it was elementary school, and I think my dad was, I hate to say it, my dad was of the 1940s generation. He was, I don't know. I love my dad. But again, like everything else, it's complicated. Just even in the phrases like, the N-word or cracker or saying that, I hate to say it, I think we're probably all guilty of letting it slip out. Like, I can't believe that.
Yeah,
But my dad, and I think he was probably, I've learned he was a jokester, but he told me one time, well, you're 2% black. And I went to school and I thought it was really cool. But again, I'm in a new generation that it's like, oh, this is cool. I'm 2% black.
Have you done your DNA?
I haven't yet, but but the interesting thing was, my grandmother learned about it, and she was like, I cannot believe you said that. Just kind of like, it's like, oh my word, and I'm like,
no. During this period, particularly during Reconstruction and the Nadir period, and you're familiar with Jefferson and Hennings, half of that family passed as white.
Are you talking about
Sally Hemmings?
Oh yeah,
Jefferson, and of course we've talked about the Creoles in Mobile and Baldwin County, and then in New Orleans. So people who, if you do your DNA, you may find something that you are not aware of. Like I was telling you about mine, 32% European. But I've been able to, on my black side, go all the way back to Benin and Nigeria and the tribe Yoruba.
Wow. Wow.
But then I got Scott, Wales, and British. So
we're all over the place. Well, anyway, now that we've gone down that wormhole, how did you? You told me a couple of your experiences here. One thing I'd love to know is what you said or from what I understand, was a civil archivist position?
Civil archives, civil records division.
Okay.
I was chief of the civil archives division.
Okay.
And all of the constitutional officers' records I was responsible for.
Okay.
Maintaining and disseminating.
Okay.
and of course the vast newspaper collection under the terrace.
Oh yeah.
And with the leaks and the water, the damage, and of course the microfilming of those,
Okay.
and the land plats. That's how I got into the land records.
Okay.
All of those original records that was thrown out of the Capitol when it was burned in '47.
Okay.
Remember? Have you seen any of those journals?
I know it was burned, but I didn't know that like all the records were just chunked out of
Yeah,
that
chunked
time.
out of the window. That's how they were preserved. And this is what Thomas Owens in 1901 opened the first state archives, and that's what populated
Okay.
the archives. The initial archives is from the records that was thrown out of the Capitol across the street.
Okay.
And of course, with his wife, Marie Bankhead,
Yeah.
and of course, her John Bankhead, Speaker of the House,
Oh yeah.
and getting this building constructed through her connection to the Speaker of the House is instrumental. And of course, who told me this one? E.D. Nixon,
Okay.
Tallulah,
Yeah.
who lost her role in Gone with the Wind to Vivian Leach because she
didn't know
was
that.
drunk.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the Bankhead family in North Alabama disowned her because she started fraternizing with black men and other people and women's. Edie Nixon told me the story about her disrobing up at the Capitol, ran out Dexter Avenue and jumped into the fountain nude. She was also with Jasper, I think. Some people came to interview her, and she came to the door naked. She was a wild woman.
Oh my word.
Now this is the Zelda Fitzgerald, that age, World War I era, where she meets Scotty Fitzgerald, the Flappers.
Yeah.
That era. And so now I understand that Marie she knew she was a famous actress now. And entertainer, but she did not represent the old South, the cultural part of the. And she had gone to London and New York and something like.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We try to be progressive when we're talking about this, but it's kind of like, she was a little risque, and we still live in that society. It's like, oh my word, what was she doing? But so when you were, how did you transition from the state archives to the Air University?
Well, Justin, so now we're in the age of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Back to our earlier discussion. Yeah. As you know, he kicked off his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
I didn't know that.
Yes. You know the significance of Philadelphia.
The
with those three civil rights.
being killed, yeah.
So the message was sent.
Okay. I
Okay.
didn't know that.
As George Wallace used to say, he put the hay down so the ghosts could get it. So now I'm working at Maxwell, and of course the military is very conservative politically. And similar to what I had gone through earlier at the state archives. Now,
Well, how did you leave the archives initially?
I'm
sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
I was in grad school, and I was working on my master's thesis, and I was hired as an intern, a co-op student.
Okay.
And I was a GS5, one of the lowest rank in civil service.
Okay.
But the thing about it, my salary doubled from what I was making here as a division chief.
Oh, wow.
So once I completed my master's thesis, I was promoted to a GS9, and of course a GS11, and then retired as GS12. But I shifted away from social history to air power history.
Okay.
And just as I had done here, I merged myself into understanding the history of air power and the United States Air Force and its predecessors.
Okay.
I understood the broad collection that we had, and we was beginning the transition, I told you, from paper to electronic. I worked on a system called IRIS, Inferential Referral Information System.
Okay.
And indexing document. My first assignment was to follow the aviation units across the Pacific to Japan from Pearl Harbor. So I mastered the indexing system, and also they trained me on security. I was reviewing for downgrade and declassification there. But I, working with the Center for Air Force History out of DC here, the Air Force was established in 1947, and they moved the collection to Maxwell to support PME education. Excuse me.
Oh, no, you're fine.
So this huge collection existed, and it went all the way back to the dirigibles, the balloons.
Do you need me to get you some more?
I got them in.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
So now I'm working with Air Force officers, and they are doing thesis and research,
Okay.
supporting the war fighters.
Okay.
So after the first month, Robert Lane, the head of the Air University Libraries, had known him from the Library Association, and he pulled me in his office and said, "Joe, what's wrong?" And I said, "Mr. Lane, I'm not sure I want to work in this environment, and I would like to go back to social history." And he gave me some advice. He said, "Joe, do your outside work, your research, come to work every day, and enjoy this salary you earn." He knew I was making more money there than I was making here, even at a lower GS rate. So I adopted, and I was able to progress up the system and acquire skills that I later used, and I became one of the most expert on air power history.
Wow.
And of course, at that time, the Tuskegee Airmen was coming in existence, and I was able to provide information to the units of the Tuskegee Air.
Okay.
They are Tuskegee Airmen unit, and of course, near the end of my career, I worked with George Lucas on Red Tail movie,
Okay.
and the National Park Service in establishing Moulton Field.
Okay.
So all of that transpired during that time, but I also was appointed in the 90s the top secret control officer,
Okay.
and the SCIF, sensitive compartmentalized information. This is signal high intelligence, so
Okay.
clearance, access to all of this information.
Okay.
That's why I don't know. When they was talking about Hillary Clinton server and all of that, I knew nothing was to that. It was all political.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I was controlling 10 million pages of classified information. And did we make mistakes? Yes. When I was top secret control officer after the first Gulf War, there's an edition of the U.S. News and World Report that is top secret.
Okay.
It was in our top secret vault.
Huh.
Most Americans read the magazine, did not know. But anyway, the commander of the Air Force, CENTCOM at that time, lost his job under the first Bush because he revealed that compartmentalized information in that magazine.
Oh, wow.
So I'm now dealing with security issues, and of course later becoming chief of circulation.
Okay.
And so Maxwell is the education center for the whole United States Air Force.
Okay.
Now, same thing I went through here. Mark Clark fellow, who's on the Navy War College now. Vietnam War had ended, and we was cataloging and indexing that. He came out with a publication called The Limits of Air Power. He was ostracized because he interpreted air power in Southeast Asia, and it was an unwinnable war. Mark was a student at the Air Force Academy working on his dissertation at that time, and that's what he used. Now they use his book to study, but when it was first put out, he was ostracized, and this revisionist view. Now, his book is the accepted version of the war. So I'm dealing with that, and I'm meeting interesting people at the same time, just like Miss LeGree here, and Jay Millstone, and Wayne Flynn, and Leah Rawl Atkinson, and Alan Jones. So you're gonna have your assholes everywhere you go. I met one lady that worked in the library, and I would speak to people. I always had an open personality, and she would go out of her way to keep from speaking to me.
Wow.
Before she retired, she came to visit me, and she apologized.
Wow.
And what I did was I defeated her with kindness, just like I used on Miss LeGree. When I told her, you don't have to call me Professor Caver, you can call me Joe. But I won her over, and she apologized. But this is a part of my journey. You run into different people with backgrounds and different ideologies. Some people just don't like you because of my race. And we have all of these discussions on racial issues, politics, and things. But we learn to respect each other. That's what you can agree to disagree. And still maintain your relationship and friendship. So that's the lesson I learned from Maxwell on that. But near the end of my career, when we first got started, the information technology people was working for us. And they geared the program to meet our needs, the metadata, the cataloging, and all of that. Before I retired, it had reversed. We was working for the information technology people instead of them working for us.
Okay.
So I tell people, particularly that are in that field, don't forget your customers, because they live in a cocoon or a bubble. And I run across it all the time. You people building system, making change to make changes, and losing their customers.
Yes.
And you see it if you go to an ATM with an elderly member, they get frustrated, and because but your generation coming up, you was born during that time, and that was generation before that. This is all alien to them. But I witnessed the transition from paper to electronic records. And one of my proudest moments, besides the Tuskegee Airmen, going to those conventions and meeting the airmen and working on the Molten Field project, and using the identifying the over 14,000 participants, and then President Bush giving them the gold medal. He used our list, my list that I compiled.
Wow.
But when President Obama was elected, and he was going to Normandy to celebrate the D-Day invasion, his grandfather, similar to a background like I was describing, his white grandfather in Kansas was a World War II veteran.
Wow.
And I was able to track his deployment, his participation in invasion, and all the way to the Rhine. Now I went through Air Force PA. I didn't get credit for that either, but I was able to uncover all of that information on individuals and to help veterans to get their VA credits and health care that they needed. So all of that was rewarding to me.
Yes, sir. Well,
I know I'm missing something, but
oh no, that's fine. And so now you had mentioned something about Ronald Reagan a little earlier, and him beginning his campaign in Philadelphia. Was that sort of?
it was a signal to Southern whites that I'm one of you. That's what I meant by putting hay down so the goats can get it. You identify whistle calls and wolf calls, and I remember Barry Goldwater, the '64 election. Now he was more a libertarian than he was a conservative, and he later recognized as you know, Johnson won in a landslide, but Goldwater carried Alabama and the southern states. It was over the '64 Civil Rights Act. And again, he later regretted advocating for that. But I see it constantly in our politics. But I recognize it. Maybe I'm more sensitive to it than most people. But I understood where Ronald Reagan was coming from. And of course, he did great things, particularly in the rebuilding of our armed forces, which had been damaged from the Vietnam War. And of course, the counterculture developing, pulling back from that. So he did great things. It's just like my grandfather, I was telling you. He created my white grandfather. You have the racism, you have the patronage, and the other relationships. So it's negatives and positives.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, I guess, so what have you, I know you've been involved in several projects since you've retired from the Air Force. And I know you've, I think just about a month or so ago, we had the commemoration of Bill Traylor. And, and different things. So what are your reflections on what you've been doing since?
Jean Rankin, who was an employee, introduced me to Bill Traylor. She was different also. And had her sister was an opera singer in New York, Neil Rankin, and she knew Charles Shannon, I believe his name was Shannon, who had collected the drawings of Bill Traylor when he was down on Monroe Street. And so when I was working here, that was my introduction to Bill Traylor. And Mary and Neely, of course, we spent a lot of time trying to find where he was buried. We found an announcement of his death. He was a pauper, and the city had to bury him. Now later they moved the body to Mount Moriah, I think, in Lowndes County. But he didn't earn a lot of money, and now his collection is worth millions of dollars. So while I was here at the archives, and Jean Rankin brought that to my attention about this famous folk artist, born a slave, migrated to Montgomery at a late age, and lived on the streets really, and using cardboards and paper to document. Cultural is, it is so fascinating, and you learn the things like Rosa Parks Library, the Empire Theater, Hank Williams playing in front of the movie theater.
I didn't
for
know
Nichols
that.
and Diane. Being taught to play the guitar by a black man named T-Top.
And actually, I live near like Ann and Harrison Road and all that. So I know Lincoln Cemetery, and I ride by that
T-top.
marker. So it's I don't know. It's
But you see
amazing.
just how the cultures. It's. I like the way Ken Burns described it, particularly on his documentary on jazz.
Okay.
Of course, jazz come out of Plessy versus Ferguson.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, where the classical trained musicians, these are the Creoles and the Octagon blacks, are forced to now live among the stevedores and the cotton pickers, and they create this unique brand of music that starts in New Orleans, goes to Memphis, Chicago, New York, and back during the Zelda Fitzgerald and Tallulah Bankhead, the Flappers.
Okay. Wow.
But and now in this country music documentary,
Yeah.
you see how the music, the religion,
Yeah.
it's all connected.
Yes, sir.
It's so, and therefore, it's not just Black history; it's our history. Because you can't separate the two because they're so interspersed together, and that's what I learned.
Yes, sir.
So I'm told all the time, you use the word, the N-word, you're being sensitive to it. But history is history, and it's not pleasant. Mrs. Carr, when they was getting ready to tear down the Greyhound bus station,
That was Mrs. Carr.
Johnny Carr.
Johnny Carr.
MIA, Montgomery Improvement Association. She got me on the board. Friendly Supper Club and all that.
Okay.
So anyway, working with the Historic Commission about the door, color entrance,
Okay.
and should it be preserved? And I said yes. And when Lisa Bueller in the Crest Building, I don't know if you've been to the Crest Building.
I have.
You've seen the colored water fountains and all that. Some people don't think those image and emblems should exist, but it is a part of our history. And it's just like my brother is one who has them into the Legacy Museum.
Okay.
It's too painful. But it's history.
Yeah.
I was telling you about the Old Harmony Church that Larry wrote in, what's the magazine? And I shared it with a friend, Frankie Pounds. He retired as a admiral in the Navy. He was Condoleezza Rice escort, but he's in Denver, so I sent it to him because his grandfather and grandmother is from the neighborhood, that community. And he said, what do you think about the membership roll where they give first names but no last name? Of course, you don't have surnames until 1866. But they listed the owners, and he found his surname, how it originates. But he said this is sort of painful to understand and realize this. So the lay people want to disregard that portion of their history out, but we can't. It's not a pretty picture. The lynchings, the burning of crosses, like I was telling you about my uncle. He's also on the Elvin Pettit Bridge, beating up John Lewis and Jose Williams.
Really?
This is my uncle on one of the horses.
Oh, wow.
This is my mama's half brother.
Well, and there's there's the concept of white guilt these days, and to me it's I know speaking as a white person, I don't know, I don't feel I need to have guilt, but I think we need to recognize.
Right. It's just like me seeing that color fountain.
Yeah.
It's a part of our history.
Yeah.
and you can't disregard it.
Yeah.
And I don't see. I try not to. Hope I don't in my discussions lead to guilt feelings.
No,
because you should be not held responsible for the action of your grandfather. You can only.
And my grandfather, he was really how I look at him, I think he really had a tender heart, and I don't think he would.
I knew this.
He would have. I just, in my mind, he would have never have become part of the KKK, but he didn't mind calling a black person the N-word. It's one of those things. It's like on the line where it's like. But anyway, sorry about that. But anyway, I don't mean to keep.
No, just and I'm enjoying talking to you.
Yes,
but
sir.
It's the complexity of our heritage. It is, and it's all joined together. And my generation of historians, we broke the mold. We moved from that Dunning School, where you thought you had to defend white aristocracy.
Yeah.
And it's it's a fascinating story, and we all came from diverse backgrounds, and we learned to get along together, and so for survival, and that's our challenge going forward. I do worry about my daughter's generation, who lives basically in a virtual world. They don't have the interaction that you and I and others are having. So, as you know, in the virtual world, there's some mean things and a lot of bad things are happening. But the social skills are lacking. So.
Well, it's kind of like when you send a text. It depends on how you phrase it. It could be you could mean nothing by it, and somebody could be offended. Like
how you interpret it.
Yeah. and I have to admit, social skills. I actually was born with I have a mild form of autism, and yeah. Well, I have to say, my mom has always. We've always said we would never make it an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so my mom has just told me, it's you're not necessarily the norm, but you have to live within the world of the norm.
Right.
So, and I think that's what I could get off on a soapbox on discipline and learning just to live with other people respectfully. But I'm kind of like, these children that act out, I'm kind of like, you don't have to abuse your child, but you could tell them no once in a while.
Right. But without you telling me, I never would have recognized.
Well, thank you.
So,
I owe that to my mama. But anyway.
But we all are different, and we all perceive information different. And so you learn to tolerate and respect each other. That's my lesson from my grandfather, my mom, my dad, my sister, the generation before me. And I try to maintain that. And it's.
And to me, this is how to have a race conversation, in my opinion, if anything, because, again, I think sometimes it ends up. It's like. When you see race conversations, a lot of time, or let's have a race conversation, it's kind of like, it's like one side's shaming the other side, and that doesn't really accomplish anything.
Name calling.
Yeah.
It's no way. But my biggest problem today is facts.
Yeah.
And you run across people with a perception of things that are actually not facts. And and Peggy, I keep going back to her.
Yeah.
Is what's factual. And some people live in a bubble and have developed an alternative view of the world that are not factually supported.
Yeah.
And we see that in our intercourse today, in our interaction. So,
Well, and I agree. And the thing is, I learned a lot. Just like eh, it's like getting your news. You have to get your news from a variety of places,
right.
and also, it's like you say. And it's like talking about Hillary Clinton, and all, no matter what you think of her, it's like with your expertise in working in government emails, you can see that it's not really a valid argument,
It's nothing
and
there.
that she,
I mean, mistakes were made, but
there's more to the story than just a straight line, like saying, well, she's evil. You have to have something more than just say that.
remember I told you about the U.S. News and World Report?
Yeah.
Classified, the top secret,
Yeah.
the war plan of the invasion of Iraq is in there.
Okay.
But what the Air Force decided, and the general public didn't know that. They read the article, but they didn't understand it was the war plan that was being revealed to them in this publication.
Okay.
Yeah, classified information slips out.
Yes, sir.
And there are no secrets in the world today.
Yes, sir.
It's one person knows it, and Ed Maxwell. We couldn't do our work because of the UFO hunters. With Project Blue Book.
Oh.
And we finally unloaded the Project Blue Book to the National Archives, and so people will call about the Roswell incident. We went out. It was a balloon.
Okay.
It wasn't aliens. I went to Roswell.
Okay.
Yeah. But we could not do our work on serving our customers because of this group of people who spend their life working on UFOs. And it's, but who am I to say that they're wrong? But it does interfere if you're a government agency, if you're spending all your time trying to prove a fact or thing. But it's, now back to my family again. I was telling you about my mama's brother, and his son got killed in Birmingham. Guess who we all relate to now? Peyton Langford the third. Trey, we call him Trey. He raised crawfish and sellers in New Orleans, and but we treat him. He treat us like we was blood.
Okay.
So the interaction, and you go through that in generation to generation. Wow. And he knows the story of his dad, how his dad died, and his grandfather.
Wow.
And his great grandfather, and his love for black women. So,
well, it is what it is. That's probably the best phrase for it.
We don't rub that portion. He knows the history. If he want to talk about it, we'll talk about it, but we don't rub it in.
Yeah.
He's not responsible. And so that's our challenge as historians.
Yeah.
Is to try to present the factual part of our history and our past. Yeah. And not the gone with the wind version.
Yes, sir.
Of our history.
Yes, sir.
And I enjoyed watching it last week on TMC.
It's interesting to watch it over time.
TCM. Yeah.
Anyway, well, I have thoroughly enjoyed this.
Well, anytime I can help you. Now I got a face with the name.
Yes, sir.
Hopefully, Fran will get my book out. I think you would enjoy it because it deals with the founding of the ASTA and black education in general in the state of Alabama. So,
yes, sir. I do have a question. Did you ever work with the Alabama Center for Higher Education?
Somewhat.
Okay, I just kind of an
through Dr. Moore.
Okay.
He was the chief. I met him through my brother-in-law. He was
Okay.
president of Talladega College,
Okay.
and then he left Talladega College and came here.
Okay.
So, and his brother was a Tuskegee Airman.
Okay.
Paul Moore.
Okay.
Mohr.
Okay.
This was back in the 80s and 90s, somewhat. So,
Well, I know there was I guess there's an ACHE now here in Montgomery, but there was one at one time in
consortium.
Birmingham. Yeah, consortium. Yes, sir.
Stillman, Talladega, Alabama State,
Yeah.
and Tuskegee. Yes.
Okay.
And this is a part of that generational change of preserving the records of these black institutions and the education.
Yes,
sir. Okay.
And also, that's been along with that and ASTA. I've also been looking at the Black Heritage Council. Have you ever worked with them?
Yes.
Okay.
Francine Taylor, what was the name? And Selma, Miss Harris.
There's, of course, Loretta Wimberly.
Loretta Wimberly. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yes, sir.
And I'm on the, which one? The Destination of Historic Sites. I'm
Okay.
on that committee.
Okay.
We meet quarterly and decide what should be on the National Landmark Register. So,
Well,
and I've served on the DeSoto Commission.
okay.
Met the mayor of Selma at that time, Joe Smitherman.
Okay.
He had lost his license because he had so many accidents. He's the mayor of Selma. He can't drive in his own city.
I didn't know that.
And this is Dr. Bridges and I. We used to drive to Tuscaloosa in that meeting. And Ed told me recently they think they found Marbelia.
Okay.
We've been looking for that
Yeah.
famous ballad there for so long.
Wow.
We also here's a mystery for you, Justin. Is when DeSoto came through here in 1530, whatever.
Yeah.
He had a black man with him that stayed behind somewhere across the river with the creeks.
Okay.
We don't know what happened to him.
I know there was I actually and I don't mean to self-promote, but I'll send you the articles I wrote. I actually found some information on that. That guy, it was John something.
Yeah,
or
he's in the journal.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, it's so I know it was up near like probably the Anniston Gadsden area where they were, but that's amazing. But anyway, we could go on.
So much history.
Yes, sir.
I gotta go. Because
Yes,
I got
sir.
a meeting at 5. So
Oh,
I need
okay.
to get me something to eat and
Well,
I go there.
it was wonderful to talk with you, sir.
Justin, I hope I come out clear and not
excellent.
non-controversial, but
Oh, well, that's fine. But thank you again for talking with me.
what a wonderful journey.
Yes.
That's
Yes, sir.